Hi, Christina. I'm back.
Hi, Colin. So we are now broadcasting. So we've right now got 12 people that have logged in. So we're just going to wait a few minutes here. So we're a bit before 10, 9:56. Look at all these keeners. So I'm just asking for people if they can, go into that chat box. Tell us where you're from. Oh, we've got Vaughan and Kettle River RV Park. Great. Thanks very much, Peter and Bonnie. Are you, Colin, able to see the chat? Great.
Yes, I am.
All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put myself on mute for a little bit. Oh, Bart, good for you. You've got a favorite BEC zone.
Favorite BEC variant.
This is true. Great. So we've got 13 people. So I'm just going to mute myself and then I'll come back on right at that 10 o'clock point.
Okay, that's great. So Bart, I can see you've got some local BEC experience. So that's great.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Kathy, great to have you here, Kathy. Let's wait a couple more minutes. Oh, I meant to check. Are you based out of Victoria?
I am. I'm based out of Victoria now. I was working or living on Bowen Island for the last 12 years or so. And so this is a new job, and I got this job. I was actually in Connecticut for about 6 months doing some research down there, and I got this new job basically just before COVID hit. So I got airlifted out of Connecticut, and I'm so glad.
Wow. So have you met a lot of your team that you're working with?
Yeah, I had a couple months here before
Okay.
the shutdown, but you know, and actually Zoom has been amazingly good for getting to know people as long as they have their videos turned on. And
agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've definitely had a couple of new hires at the RDKB after COVID, and it's been sort of interesting as you do that switch over. Wow. So have you done much work in terms of tying in back to the US system?
I wasn't doing BEC related research in the US. I have been involved in the new research that's being done to do BEC mapping in the US. And so I'll actually show some of the maps, the BEC maps for the US today.
Great. Okay. Sorry, I didn't catch you out there. Great. I am just going to start. It looks like we're at the 10 o'clock. We've got 18 people that have logged in. So thank you very much, everybody. And for those that have jumped into that chat box and told us where you're from and any preferences to the BEC systems. So it's great to see so many names joining in on the webinar. I know I don't know all of you, but I am certainly working my way through the boundary regions. So for any of the local boundary folks, don't ever hesitate to stop in at the RDKB office here in Grand Forks and introduce yourself if we haven't met already. This is a topic that I think is really important and I personally think is super interesting. We're here to learn about the Biogeoclimatic ecosystem classification system here in British Columbia with that focus on the boundary region and how that classification may evolve in the boundary as we take into consideration climate shifts expected through climate change projections. So I'm going to let Colin's going to be going into that. To begin, I want to first acknowledge the First Nations and Indigenous influence on the Boundary region and the First Nations traditional history here in our boundary watersheds, with an appreciation that the land on which many of us gather on and is referenced in this webinar is a converging traditional and unceded territory of the Selk'namic Sinixt people, as well as the Métis people who have also touched these lands and these watersheds. We're grateful to have this opportunity to be able to share knowledge and information amongst our team today. So thank you everybody for joining in on this. So what are we doing here? What's the plan? Deb McKillop will be speaking to us about the BEC system in BC, joined in with Colin here, how it's determined and what does it look like for the boundary region. Colin Mahoney will be working with Deb on this, as well as expanding into the influences of climate change projection. And I've probably really been a bit brief on this, so I obviously will sort of work with that. Who are Deb and Colin? Deb McKillop is a research ecologist, forest lands, natural resource operations, and rural development. So many of you have received that confirmation email. And so you've seen a lot of the write-up of both Colin and Deb. So for those of you that know the Nelson area, Deb works at the BC Government Nelson office, that pink building right downtown Nelson, and out of the Kootenay boundary region. So the region here that the boundary is managed by. She moved to Nelson in 1995, but as she reminded me, we're up in Edgewood. So if any of you have gone over the Granby Wilderness back roads, you will drop into Edgewood right by the Arrow Lake. So that's some of the areas that Deb certainly knows well and grew up in. Deb's Kootenay through and through. She's written 2 field guides for Southeast BC and updated back, and is in the process of completing the 3rd, which some of you may have picked up on, which is our region, Boundary, Okanagan, Southern Ontario, which should be published mid next year. Colin Mahoney, research climatologist, as we heard, is just fairly new to the position, which is really exciting. We're certainly very glad to have him here. Works with climate change and integrated planning branch of the Chief Forester's Office. So also Flunrod, Forest Lands, Natural Resource Operations, and Rural Development. Colin is a registered professional forester with experience in the Biogeoclimatic ecosystem classification systems throughout BC. So my story is, when I was first looking at trying to put this together, I was asking around, like I'd like to have some of that forecasting. I'd like to see some of that bit of the background, and then maybe what's going to be happening in the future. And everyone kept saying, well, have you talked to Colin? This is what he did for his PhD. Like, you should talk to Colin. Colin just came in with the Chief Forester's Office. So thank you, Colin. I'm just really excited to be able to have you on this. And so for his PhD, oh, there we go. Colin, research PhD, UBC Forestry established the potential for the new BEC climate types to emerge in southern British Columbia due to global heating. So very much in line with what we're looking for. Myself, I'm Christina Anderson, watershed planner for the RDKB. I've been in this position for just over a year now, and also in Grand Forks area. Like we said, based in that Grand Forks RDKB office here. And the RDKB goals for these webinars is basically just to explore boundary watersheds, just sharing different information and learning. And pretty excited to hear what we're gonna have from Deb and Colin. So a few quick housekeeping items for today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded. If you would like a copy, please email me and I'll forward one through watershedplanner@rdkb.com, or you can just contact the RDKB and route me through via phone. Attendees are going to be muted through this webinar. We do have a chat box, which many of you have been using, which is great, and a Q&A option in this webinar. So both of these are going to be able to be found just at that bottom bar of your screen. If you don't see it, sometimes if you move your cursor down below, it will pop up. So that might be something that you can do. So for the chat box, I'm asking if you've got any technical issues, or there's something that we can quickly do, like trying to deal with background noises, please put that in the chat box. I'll be monitoring that one fairly closely as we go through. Any Q&A questions, looking for answers, or maybe points for clarification, if you can put it in that Q&A box. And then if it's something that I'm able to answer, great, I'll do that. Otherwise, we may end up we'll just wait until Colin's finished. So what we're lucky to have here, Deb McKillop is going to be logging in shortly. And so Deb's actually in the field. I'll let her, when she logs in, speak a little bit about what she's doing and where she is. So we just chatted with her a few minutes ago. So as soon as she's back into, what I'm still looking over, call it internet service maybe, she'll be logging in through there.
I see a note from Deb.
Oh, okay.
Saying,
oh, can you hear me? No, we can't. So that's interesting. Let me take a look and see if I can find Deb. All right, I am wondering. So we may end up, oh, I wonder if,
oh, there we go.
oh, there we go. There she is.
Can you hear me now?
I sure
Yes.
can. Thanks,
Perfect.
Deb. Okay, well, I'm just gonna quickly, as we're here on this, I'm just going to quickly run into a couple of polls for everybody. So everybody's been great in letting me know sort of where you are, where you're from. Just going to give a quick rundown. I know a lot of you put this into the chat box, but do you live in the Boundary region? We'll give it a few minutes here. And we'll find out how many people are calling in from the Boundary and how many are outside. Because I do know that I've had a number of people contacting me over the last couple weeks or week or so coming in from outside of the Boundary region. Oh, nice. 80% of the people. All right, I think I'm going to I'll end the polling right now. Great, so 57%, so we've got majority of people in the Boundary, so that's super. And really neat, really great spread between all the different areas. So I have two other quick polls here. Let's see if I can. I am interested, if you don't mind, I'm interested in how did you hear about this webinar? Facebook, email, newspaper, word of mouth. So if you don't mind, it's sort of one of those interesting ones with these watershed webinars to try to figure out what is the most effective way of trying to get some of this information out. Thank you very much, everybody, for sending through. And then the next one, for those of you that are just so excited to find out what the next one's going to be. Right, so it does look like email is the most obvious one. And the next one is just, and this is going to be really good for Colin and Deb. What is your knowledge of the Biogeoclimatic ecosystem classification system? Are you, have you heard of it before? And Shaq, are you an expert? Are you vying for some of these big jobs? Great, we're at 60% of people that have voted. And wait a few more seconds here. Great, I'm gonna flip that up there. And so nice, we definitely have that familiarity for a lot of people of what the BEC system is. So generally understand the process, so that's great. People have never heard of it before, so didn't even know about the acronym. And oh, sorry about that. I forgot to share the results. Great. On that note, I will pass it over to Colin and Deb. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Christina. So I'll just share my screen here. Start on the PowerPoint. Okay, so Deb and I are giving an overview of the Biogeoclimatic ecosystem classification and some climate change forecasting for the Boundary region. I'm more of I'm knowledgeable about the forecasting side of things, and Deb is the absolute guru of the BEC system, especially in southeastern BC. So I've split this up into three sections. Just a quick intro, why we need BEC and how we got it, that I'll just present, and then Deb will go into more detail about the BEC system and especially in the Boundary context. And And then I'll look at climate change through a BEC lens and show some results for the boundary region at the end. So, so the first section, why we need BEC and how we got it. When we look at forest ecosystems, there's similarities and differences. You know, these are two forests that I worked in on the coast, and we can see, you know, they both are slopes of approximately the same angle, but they've got different species of trees, different species of vegetation, different soils, looks like different climates. So ecosystems are very complex, and we need a structure to organize our knowledge and to communicate about these different ecosystems. So an ecosystem classification can be used for learning, communicating, and managing ecosystems. And that's what BEC does. It classifies ecosystems in terms of two key drivers of ecosystem function: climate and soils. So these are Deb slides that I got from her years ago when I was teaching the BEC system at UBC. And you know, before BEC, you would have had to go through this long process of describing the specific site you were on, and it would be difficult to communicate that. Whereas after BEC, we have names for these specific sites, these climates and soil types, and the vegetation they're associated with. And so communicating among practitioners and managing the ecosystems of British Columbia is much more feasible under BEC. And I thought I'd go back right to the origins of BEC because there's a really interesting story behind the man who originated this system. His name was Vladimir Krajina, and he had quite an amazing life story. He was a professor of botany in Prague, and when in 1939, at the outset of the Second World War, he became a leader of the Czech underground resistance to the Nazis. And after the war, he became a political leader, and he opposed the emerging communist tyranny. And eventually, he was forced to flee on skis over the mountains to Austria in 1948, and made his way to UBC as a botany professor. And so pretty much from the ground up, he developed the BEC system from the early 1950s into the 1970s. And then at that point in the 70s, it was adopted by the BC Forest Service and codified into the system that we know it by people like Deb, the regional ecologists of this province. So he was an outspoken critic of industrial forestry practices of the day. And that's why he actually moved from UBC Forestry to UBC Botany. And he used the BEC system, for example, to design BC's ecological reserve system. So he was a really important person in the development of this system. So Krajina broke the complexity of ecosystems into two key factors: climate, which is the regional level influences on ecosystem function, and site, so the local influences, the soil factors. There was also a chronological classification, but that has not really been developed as much. The problem faced by Krajina was that there was very little data on climate and soils in most areas of the province. And so, you know, if you wanted to determine climate and site factors and you don't have a weather station and a soil chemistry lab, he had the insight to use indicator plans. So this is what makes the work of Krajina and his successors so unique. They had a really deep understanding of what plants tell us about climate and soils. Each plant is like a little weather station or a little soil lab with its specific range of tolerances. And each species has a range of tolerances to climate and soil. Sometimes these are quite broad, But together, when you look at the plant community as a whole, you get the intersection of these tolerances, and that indicates often a very specific range of conditions. So if you blindfolded an ecologist like Cryena or Deb McKillop and flew them into a random location in British Columbia and removed the blindfold, they would probably know where they were and be able to tell you all sorts of information about the climate in site just by looking at the plant community. And that's the power of the BEC system, is it infers ecosystem function based on plants. So this is the last slide of this section. This just shows the current map of biogeoclimatic zones. So these are the climates that the BEC system uses. There's 16 zones and then 200 other smaller subzones and subzone variants of the climate system. Okay, so over to Deb now.
Hi, everybody. Not sure if you can see me, but I am currently in the Boundary working on some BEC projects over here. I work, as Colin said, out of the Nelson Office of Forest Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development. I can't even get the whole acronym. And right now I am standing at the bottom of the Nicholson Road, just outside of Rock Creek for all you Boundary locals. And I'm working on a project to map site series, and I'll get into that in a little bit. I see Colin now. Do you guys see Colin, or do you see where I am? Oh, Colin, what do you see?
We see you. We sure
okay,
do.
Perfect.
I see you.
You got your background and everything, and you're coming through very loud and clear.
Awesome. So can I get the next slide? Colin went through this already, but just as a quick overview, there's two main levels of the BEC Biogeoclimatic Ecosystem Classification System. At the broad level, there's the climate maps, and Colin already showed you one of those, and you have zones, you have subzones, and you have variants. Right now, I'm standing in what is currently mapped as the Ponderosa Pine PP XH, so very dry, hot 3 boundary variant. But soon I'm going to rename it into the IDF. What is it? IDF XX1. So at these broad levels, climate controls broad vegetation patterns. But at a site level, we have the site series classification, where the site, the soils, and the plants all come together to help us understand what's happening. Next slide. So you can see that here in this slide, that the map, and I apologize that this is the East Kootenay, not Boundary. I was in a rush to get out in the field and didn't make a new one for this slide, and I should have. You can see that this is the Rocky Mountain Trench. Each of the colors represents that broad climate envelope for the subzone variant. On the right-hand side of my slide, you see what we call a landscape profile diagram, and that's for each site series, each specific site, and then below you see that this is happening through, and I'll walk you through this in the next slides. They show it a little better. Next slide. So BEC is not vegetation classification. Vegetation is a really important component of the BEC system because, as Colin explained really well, it's an indicator of what's going on. But BEC is site-based classification. And what that means is that sites with similar physical characteristics, similar slope, similar aspects, similar soils, have similar vegetation and productivity potential within similar climates. So basically, similar climates lead to similar plant community patterns. And this is one of the biggest strengths of the BEC system in comparison to any other vegetation classification used in Western North America, because we can understand the relationship between climate, site, and plants. And as the climate changes, we can have people like Colin come in and understand what the potential is, what could happen under different scenarios, because the site, the soils, the slope, the aspect, that's not going to change. The climate will change, is changing, And that will have an influence on what plants can grow there, what productivity, what habitats could change, and what potential, what might happen in a changing environment. And that's really valuable. Next slide. So I showed you this at a smaller image. This is sort of the typical site series or ecosystem pattern in a mountainous environment. At the top of a hill, and it's not necessarily the top of a mountain, but the top of a hill, it's the driest. A raindrop falls, it has nowhere to go but downhill. The upper slopes again are dry. Warm aspect, cool aspect has a very big influence. So next slide, and I'll explain this a little better. So here you can see Douglas fir and some drier site on the top, on the rocky site. This is the driest ecosystem in the example that I'm showing. And this ecosystem that I'm walking you through is the ICH DW1. And that occurs around Christina Lake as you're getting into the wet belt a little bit more. Next slide. At the bottom of the slope, moisture pools. It has nowhere to go, so it just stays. And the wettest ecosystems in that unit have skunk cabbage. And most of you have probably seen skunk cabbage. And if you haven't, I hope you get to one day because it's pretty cool. Next slide. So you can see here that there's a pattern of the dry ecosystems on the top, the skunk cabbage at the bottom, and in between you have in-between ecosystems. And you can see that from those plant communities. Here you have, you know, a big cedar old growth stand in your lower slopes, and you have a Doug fir on a warm aspect on this ecosystem. So next slide. This is happening not on a whole mountain, but in each of those climate envelopes. And again, this is an East Kootenay example, but it would be the same here in the boundary if you just change it to IDF DM2, which if I turn this way behind me over my shoulder, that's the IDF DM2 on the other side of the mountain. MSDM1 above it, and then ESSF DC1 is the coding. We speak in these crazy BEC languages that I apologize, but it's a whole language that we understand, kind of like the little deers in the opening slides that Colin had. So next slide. Again, if I come back to this ICH, interior cedar, hemlock, dry, warm example, where we had the dry Douglas fir and maybe some ponderosa pine on the rocky sites, the driest, and we had cedar and skunk cabbage in the bottom. And then if we go to the ESSF, next slide, we get the same kind of pattern of ecosystems, but the plants are completely different. So here, instead of Douglas fir in the Engelmann spruce subalpine fir, which is your upper elevations, you have lodgepole pine, subalpine fir. Instead of skunk cabbage down in the wet spots, you have false hellebore, Canby's lovage. So we can understand those patterns. And as Colin will walk you through, you know, maybe in a future climate scenario, that Engelmann spruce subalpine fir higher elevation forest might have a climate that's a little bit more like that lower elevation, mid elevation, interior cedar, hemlock, dry, warm. And if that happens, how will we get from a skunk cabbage cedar to from a hellebore Canby's lovage spruce forest to a climate that would support more of a skunk cabbage cedar ecosystem. So we can really understand that stand level, what's around you in the context of the landscape, in the context of elevational bands, and in the context of climate change. Next slide. Oh, I'm behind on I have this on my iPad as I go too. So I always say when I work in boundary, they call it boundary for a reason. It's not just because it's a boundary from the Okanagan to the Kootenays or Canada to the US. Ecologically, there are strong and fast transitions that occur in the boundary. And this is a slide of climate subregions. The whiter colors are the very dry climates. So you can see the Okanagan and even Grand Forks and Rock Creek. And I'm even standing at this moment in a very dry climate subregion in just at the valley bottom in Rock Creek. And then the lighter gray is the dry, the darker gray is the moist, and the black to the north on the map is the wet climate subregion. And you can see that the boundary kind of is in that transition. And I think the way to really understand what's happening in terms of climate in the boundary is to take even a bigger step back and start thinking about how the weather patterns and where the moisture comes from. We know we're at southern latitudes in British Columbia. We know there's a lot of heat in the sun, but the moisture patterns are really important. And those moisture patterns come from the the Pacific Ocean, the clouds come, they hit the West Coast, you know, Vancouver Island, Haida Gwaii. It's really, really wet. They come across Vancouver Coast Mountains, still a lot of moisture in there. And then they hit the interior plateau and they kind of roll along because there's really no mountains there. It's just rolling hills, a couple mountains, but nothing really big. And then they get to the boundary, and the boundary is the foothills to the Montachis, essentially. And then you get into the Montachis at the eastern extent. And that's where those clouds start to lift. If you remember from high school or university or college geography, orographic precipitation, as the clouds rise, they drop moisture, they get that wetness in there. So understanding that is important for understanding those patterns, because even in a changing climate, we will still have those patterns. Will we have more precip? Will we have less precip? The other thing about boundary is that, you know, you can go, and I'm standing in the perfect spot. Hopefully you can see over my shoulder. That way you go from grasslands to forest, and then all of a sudden you're in a cedar forest, cedar hemlock, or you're in a high elevation spruce, subalpine fir forest, and these happen really, really fast. So next slide. Boundaries. Oh, next slide after that. Oh no, I think I accidentally sent this before I had a different slide. So let's go back to that colorful one and I'll just walk you through it. Sorry, I must have hit save after I hit send on my email. So here what you have is 2 maps, which is great. You can see the map on the left is Old Beck. I started working in this job in 2007, and that's what the Beck map looked like. Again, each of these colors is what you can think of as a climate envelope, or if you are anywhere, if you look out the window and you can see some hills, you can see that the valley bottom has drier ecosystems. In Boundary, you'll see ponderosa pine if you're where most people live at the valley bottoms. And if you look up to the mountaintops, you might not be able to see because there's a bit of haze and smoke, but you'll see you go from that ponderosa pine to the Douglas fir larch to the spruce subalpine fir. So each of these colors represents that kind of change. And within each of those, we have those dry sites, those wet sites, those in-between sites. And I've been working very hard to finish updating the mapping so that we have better baseline data for projecting climate change, and so that we have a better understanding of what our ecosystems are in the current context. And on the left, you can see that there's the old mapping. You see a lot more light blue, which is the ICH MK1, which and a lot more dark purple. You also see a bunch of bright green to the east, which is a newly mapped unit in 2016, the ICHMW5. And I guess before I get into the details of this, if people really want more information on this, I can do something that's more specific to those expert or more advanced BEC users. And I'll start doing some of that outreach. I meant to do it earlier, but COVID kind of got in the way of things. And you can just message Christina and she can let you know what's going on there. But the gist of this is that I'm working on a new field guide for site identification, classification, and for the overview gist of it. And that I'm hoping to have released in early spring 2021. I have it mostly written. I'm just going through all of the details, and you know, there's a lot of details to go through. So next slide. And this is my final slide. The green shows the volume 1 South Columbia Mountains, and that field guide was released in 2016, not 206. The purple is the East Kootenay Rocky Mountain Trench, and that field guide was released in 2018. And the brown is the one that you're probably the most interested in, and that's one that I am working on now for the Boundary Okanagan Southern Arrow. That eastern extent of the area was released in a temporary supplement in 2016, so that's been in use for several years. And then the ones that are peripheral, the North Columbia Mountains and the Merritt Okanagan, are also in the works. And new field guides really help us just to understand. They come with new mapping as well at those climate envelopes, so they help us to understand what's happening better, what could happen better, and to identify that on the ground. So unfortunately, I have to go and do some field work because I have a crew behind me waiting for me. But if there's any questions, let me know, and through Christina, and thank you for the time.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm just going to quickly put out there, is there any questions quickly for Deb before she takes off? I don't see anything in the chat or the Q&A box.
I feel like it's more of a general overview and that the questions will be much more specific, and you can send me an email, deb.mckillop@gov.bc.ca, and there's a bunch of details that we will go into as this goes through with particularly with the licensee partners and government district partners in terms of tree species selection and stocking standards. And the project I'm working on now is mapping those site series, those site units, those dry, intermediate, wet sites within each of those climates. So we are working on what's called the PEM map. So that hopefully will be out at some point. It's not my project, I'm just helping. So if you have those kind of questions, let's talk later. And thanks, Colin. I wish I could see your slides. Send me your slides so I can look at them after.
Will do. Deb, thank you for the David Attenborough experience of the back presentation.
On your left, on your right. Thank you, guys. Take care.
Thank you very much, Deb.
Bye.
You.
All right. Well, I'll take it from there. So now we get to climate change through a BEC perspective. BEC was not designed with climate change in mind. I think, at the time, climate was seen as variable, but over long periods of time, as the climate of a given site was envisioned as staying the same. And that was a completely reasonable assumption at the time, the correct assumption, but those days are over. And we are now in a time of transitionary climates. And we have to think, given that one of the key pillars of the BEC system is climate, what this means for the BEC system. But you can flip it around, and also you can see BEC as this very detailed map of climates and a very ecologically grounded climate classification. So this is an incredible advantage as we grapple with climate change and how to manage our ecosystems in a changing climate. So this is the topic that I'm really passionate about. So this is a general graph of climate change in southeastern BC. This is for more like in the Cranbrook area. This example is, and I'll get into the more detailed stuff for the boundary region later. But we see a historical range of variability, and then starting in the 70s, increasing temperatures. This is summer daytime temperatures. And we see, there's different models. And so we have a range of different models. And we also see different scenarios. An emission scenario of extreme fossil fuel expansion, and an emission scenario maybe more consistent with our current trajectory, RCP 4.5, where fossil fuels are gradually reduced over the 21st century. So, I study this stuff all the time, and I struggle with what a graph like this means for our ecosystems, because we don't really have much context. We really just have the historical range of variability. But this is where BEC can really help. So just as an example, this is the Rocky Mountain Trench near Cranbrook, and let's just go to a specific location on the side of this mountain, the Needles. This is the mountaintop here. This is the valley bottom. This is the floodplain of the Columbia River, and this is our location. So temperature decreases as you go uphill. That's called the environmental lapse rate, and so we can actually plot this historical variability of summer temperatures in terms of elevation equivalents, right? So this is our average location. This is our location. It's got an average temperature of about 20 degrees, and some years are colder, and so they're more like locations at 1,800 meters. Some years are warmer, closer to the toe slopes of this mountain. And we can plot that over time, the temperatures are going to become more like the valley bottom under this scenario RCP 4.5. And we can express that in terms of BEC. So Deb was talking about how when you're standing in a valley bottom, looking at a mountainside, you can actually see written in the vegetation climatic changes, right? Where you go from ponderosa pine, Douglas fir at the toe slopes, into Douglas fir and larch, into spruce and pine trees, into Engelmann spruce, subalpine fir, and finally into the alpine, non-forested alpine areas. And so you can, this plot is showing that this location over time will have a climate more similar. So rather than having lodgepole pine and spruce, you're going to be having a climate that's more suitable for ponderosa pine and Douglas fir associated with this IDF XX2 Biogeoclimatic variant. And so that's, you can visualize that also as the climate band shifting uphill. Now we can look at that other scenario of more extreme fossil fuel expansion or utilization globally, where we have higher rates of temperature change. And you can see that the temperature equivalency is actually dropping through the valley floor. So now we're getting into a climate that is novel to this, this whole landscape as a whole. And we'd have to start looking further south for potential analogs for those temperatures at the end of the 21st century. So this idea that you can understand climate change in terms of shifting biogeoclimatic units was originally developed by Andreas Hamann and Tong-Li Wang at UBC. Andreas is now at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. And this was back in 2006. And I call these biogeoclimatic projections, the nickname is flying BEC zones. But essentially what it does is you take a machine learning algorithm and you train it to recognize biogeoclimatic map units in terms of their climatic attributes, so their temperature, the precipitation of the different seasons. And then you feed that machine learning algorithm a set of new climates, projected climates, future climates of your location of interest. This is British Columbia. And you ask that model, okay, give me the biogeoclimatic variant that best matches those future conditions. And what that gives you is a map of how the climates, how the BEC units are shifting across the landscape. So you can see in this example from a 2012 paper by Tong-Li Wang, the interior Douglas fir zone shifting northward into the Chilcotin Plateau in the central interior. You see a large expansion of the ICH, this light green interior cedar hemlock zone. You see an uphill expansion of Douglas fir, of coastal western hemlock zone. And so this has become a really useful and influential approach. Now, one of the problems with this up until now was that we didn't have biogeoclimatic mapping for the adjacent United States and Alberta. And so what we would see, this is what my PhD research was on, is that there's areas where ICH stays, or interior cedar hemlock stays interior cedar hemlock, and coastal western hemlock stays coastal western hemlock. Not because it's a more stable climate, but simply because we don't have analogs for the warmer versions of these southern interior climates. So Will McKenzie, who's the provincial BEC ecologist, has spearheaded an initiative to map to do biogeoclimatic mapping for the adjacent United States and Alberta. And this is a really incredible initiative, given that our map of BC BEC zones was developed over 50 years. And this new mapping has been done over the course of 5 years or so. And it uses all of the tools of machine learning and plot availability that we have available to us now. So you can see there's some of the familiar biogeoclimatic zones, like the bunchgrass zone, which really is just in specific small areas of the Fraser and Thompson valleys, just in the very valley bottoms, like around Kamloops and Williams Lake. But that is actually a huge ecosystem in the Snake River Basin and Eastern Washington. We also see the ICH extending down, the coastal Western Hemlock zone extending down. There's an occurrence of the Gulf Islands type ecosystem in Western Oregon. But we also see new ones, the interior Grand Fir zone in northeastern Oregon. We also have the subboreal Aspen Parkland, these new zones. And each of these zones has more variance. So I've zoomed in, and so we have hundreds of new climate types identified through this mapping. It's a really amazing initiative. So that's allowed us to do updated biogeoclimatic projections for British Columbia. This is something that I've been working on with Will Mackenzie. And this shows our, on the left, you have the baseline biogeoclimatic zone map, which we've approximated as representing the climate of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And then we did a biogeoclimatic projection for the past 30 years, recognizing that some climate change has already occurred. And you can see that there's already been some substantial changes. This is all a draft methodology, but and we're looking into what these might mean and validating these projections. But you do see, for example, the interior Douglas fir zone spreading up into the central interior, as with the interior cedar hemlock zone. And these are some significant changes. And then as we project forward, this is just a single global climate model. But for the 2020s, that's like the 2011 to 2040 period. We see that trend continuing. So the Douglas fir zone expanding up into northwestern British Columbia. We see an uphill expansion of the ICH zone and the CWH zones into the subalpine areas. And we see the emergence of some new units, like this subboreal Aspen Parkland from southern Alberta coming into the Peace River Valley, and the interior Grand Fir zone from northeastern Oregon coming into the lee side of the Coast Mountains. And so this is from this publication that's just coming out that Will and I have been developing, and it's showing the incursion of non-BC climates. So we can see that the main area where climates from the United States are coming in is in the valley bottoms of the southern interior, as we would expect. And you can see there's quite a lot of that in the boundary. So this is the percentage of models that are projecting non-BC climates for the 2050s period. And that's already occurring to some extent in the 2020s. So feel free to raise your hand for any questions. I don't see the chat box right now with the current viewer, so Christina, just let me know if any questions come up, okay?
Yeah, I'm watching it closely, and thanks for mentioning that, Colin. So just, yeah, feel free to raise your hand. I am watching the attendees and the Q&A box, but looks good. And I gotta say, this is fantastic. This is really, really interesting.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much. I already have questions. I didn't know we had done Alberta and USA, so that's incredible. All right, I'm signing off again.
So, so just so I could give you some local information on this. I did some. I created a little interactive browser that's just draft. You know, it's just for me to use. But I thought I could run you through some of the projections for the boundary region, and I used the RDKB boundary, so it includes a little bit of the Kootenays here. Apologies to any of you boundary nativists out there. So let's go. So first we'll look at the current BEC map. And I apologize, there's a little bit of a lag while it processes data. So this is the current BEC map for the boundary. There's this orange is the interior Douglas fir zone. The pink is the montane spruce zone, so just slightly higher elevations. The green is the interior cedar hemlock zone, more of the wet belt climate of the Kootenays. And then the purple is the Engelmann spruce subalpine fir zone. So that's the subalpine climate that's all throughout the Columbia Mountains. And if I can just turn down the transparency a bit, just to give you a sense of kind of where these stand. So we can see, you know, this is the highway running through. So a lot of what you drive through is the interior Douglas fir zone, and then you're seeing up on the hillsides the montane spruce and the Engelmann spruce subalpine fir. Here's Christina Lake there, and Beaverdale in these valleys.
So Colin, we
Yes.
had one question that, well,
Sure.
questions, but one question that I think might help a couple people. They just asked for the fossil fuel component definition, please. So I think they're referencing to your emission standards of 8.5 and 4.5. We did have a presentation earlier on a climate change from PEC, and so we spoke a little bit about some of that, but I think that might help as we move forward. So the other question will wait till the end. It was my question as well. So thanks.
Okay, so is this a better understanding of the emission scenarios that I'm using here?
I think it's, yeah, it's an understanding of, you know, when you say 8.5 and versus 4.5. So Martin, hopefully I've understood your question correctly. Just, I think an understanding of what does it mean, and why would we maybe use the 8.5 versus say the 4.5?
Okay, I'll just bring up another presentation, see if I can.
Sorry, I didn't mean to break into you, Al.
Totally fine. Yeah, it's worth going through this stuff. So yeah, this might not be the best slide to use, but okay, so this is emission scenarios for so when we talk about emission scenarios, when we model global climate change, we need to make different assumptions about how global society will develop, how our population will develop, how our economies will use fossil fuels, and that's what emission scenarios do. And there's many different possibilities. That is a future that's very difficult to predict. And so rather than making predictions, we make different projections according to these different scenarios. So this shows net CO2 emissions, so fossil fuel and land use emissions historically up until 2014, and then according to different emission scenarios. So you can see the RCP 8.5 is a scenario of rapid industrial development, kind of along the lines of what China went through in the 2000s, with massively increasing use of fossil fuels, a 7-fold increase in the use of coal, and no limits, no policy limits on the use of fossil fuels. And then there's this other scenario, RCP 4.5 envisions a different path where fossil fuels come to a peak and decline in the 2080s, and then stabilize at a low level after that. So a level kind of like fossil fuel consumption of the 1970s after that. And then there's RCP 2.6, which is more like what's in line with the ambitions of the Paris Agreement. Maybe I'll just leave it at that, just as a primer on the emission scenarios. But in this presentation that I'm giving you, I'm focusing on RCP 4.5 because there's emerging agreement that RCP 4.5 represents business as usual, given our current trajectory of the economics of green technologies, of renewable power, and also the policy environment that we're in now, where there are some policies that reduce emissions.
Thank you very much. I think that helps. So we'll
Okay.
follow up with any more specifics on that afterwards. Yeah,
Sure.
no, I've got the response to say thank you. That clarifies. So great.
Okay.
I appreciate that, Colin.
Okay, so you can see here, I've got choose an emission scenario, and I'm working with RCP 4.5. Okay, so we go from our current BEC map, which is also here, and that'll stay there. And we can look at the biogeoclimatic projection for the recent period, so 1991 to 2019. And there's a few key changes. So we see the emergence of ponderosa pine climates. We see the expansion of the interior Douglas fir zone northwards. We see the replacement of some montane spruce zones with interior cedar hemlock zone. And we also see the shrinking of the ESSF zone. So this is the interior cedar hemlock zone moving uphill and displacing the Engelmann spruce subalpine fir zone. So that uphill displacement is really intuitive in what we would expect. Other things like the interior cedar hemlock, so this is the MK1 moving westward into the montane spruce. That's something that needs needs more analysis, right? We need to. I need to work with someone like Deb to interpret what that means and look into the actual climate change that's contributing to that. Now, if we look on the right here, I put just some plots of climate change, and you can see with summer mean temperatures, we go from the 1960s as baseline climate, and over the last 30 years, there has been this large increase in summer temperatures that's pretty in line with projections for the 2020s from global climate models. And so that's why we see these changes on the landscape. Okay, so now we can move into projections of the future. So this is for the 2020s, the 2011 to 2040 period. We see much of those same trends continuing. There's a range of different models that project for this period. I'm using 8 different models, and ENS, that's ensemble vote, so it's kind of the ensemble mean. That's what I'm mapping here. So we see some significant changes here. So not only do we have the expansion of the interior Douglas fir zone into the valleys eastward, we see the bunchgrass zone. So this is bunchgrass MW from Washington State. This is bunchgrass also from Washington, a drier and hotter version. And so that's significant because the bunchgrass zone is a non-forested climate. And so this doesn't mean necessarily that we're going to move into a bunchgrass ecosystem in these valley bottoms, but it does mean that we have a climate that that does not support long-term stable tree growth. So as we see disturbance in these areas, if there's a fire that comes through, or if there's harvesting, it could be very difficult to establish trees on those sites. So we also see further uphill movement of the ESSF zone and contraction of the montane spruce zone as well. So looking further into the future, into the 2050s, so that's the 2041 to 2070 period, 30 years from now. The trends continue. Significantly, look at the contraction of the ESSF zone. So now our subalpine ecosystem is really just at the very tops of the hills in this area. And we do start to see a novel biogeoclimatic zone, the interior Grand Fir zone from Oregon coming in, as well as a large expansion of that bunchgrass zone. So this is the ensemble mean. We can also look at individual models. So let's look at the Hadley Center model. So this is the model that's projecting the driest conditions for the future. And this model is showing many of the same patterns, even more ICH in the west of the boundary, but a large incursion of the interior Grand Fir zone from Oregon. So as we, as ecologists and climatologists, look at these projections, we are interested not just in the mean condition, but in what all the models are the variability or the variation among the models. And we need to consider some of these kind of outlying models and what they're projecting for climate conditions. And we need to start looking at these zones like the IGF-MM from Oregon, and speaking with foresters working in those zones and ecosystem managers in Oregon to try to understand how to manage these ecosystems given these climates. What are the tree species that do well in these climates? What can we expect for our current forests, given that these climates are coming into British Columbia? So it's a extremely challenging time and a time of great concern for ecosystem managers, but it's also a very, very interesting time to be doing this kind of work, because it really means we need to be doing a lot of cross-border interaction with ecosystem managers from the United States. And maybe I'll leave it at that. It's 11 o'clock, and I'm interested in any questions you have.
Thank you. Colin, this was fantastic. I just have a quick question.
Sure.
so you referenced it as an app. Is this publicly available? Or is this something that you have?
Not yet.
Saying, okay.
No, this is like my, this is something I'm working towards to, we're trying to make biogeoclimatic projections like this more available, and it's something that we will work towards over the next year or so. Right now this is just something that I cooked up for this presentation, and so I'm just going to keep it to myself for now. but yeah, I'd like to move this direction so people can work with their look at projections for their area, and really zoom in as well, and
wow.
think about what it means for their given sites.
This is
yeah.
This is great. So we do have quite a few questions that have been coming in. So we've got 6 questions. Do you want me to read them out, or do you want to? Is that easier?
Oh, yeah. Let me see.
So one.
If I can get the. I just want to see if I can get the.
Sure. You should be able to just click on that Q&A box.
I'm not even seeing. Oh, meeting controls. Oh yeah, here we go. Okay, Q&A. Well, why don't I just read them out?
Okay, either one. Yeah.
So first one, are BEC maps or shapefiles for Washington available to download? The answer is not yet, but they will be in the future. Those maps are currently draft. We're using them for our scientific publications, but they're not yet available.
So I guess I've got a question sort of tying into that. With building so we are transboundary at the Kettle River watershed, and there's a lot of work that is being done. And we're pretty lucky that we've got some great relationships with our southern counterparts in our region here. How much involvement have the states been with this mapping, the BEC, or for that matter, Alberta, with the mapping? Is it all BC going down and ground truthing, or is it, are they involved, or they're trying to get their BEC information?
So the method was primarily BC ecologists, so BEC ecologists, using an extensive plot database from the United States. So it's the FIA plots. There's tens of thousands of vegetation plots, and feeding that into the BEC methodology, and then doing machine learning mapping of these units that have been classified by hand. But now it is in a stage of very much reaching out to ecologists from the United States, and there's quite a few practitioners down there that are very excited about this work because it's a new type of climate mapping for the United States. And then there's also been some reconnaissance ground truthing as well.
Oh,
so it's the kind of thing that will develop over a long period of time. But certainly the draft version is very useful, even if it's not perfect. And we are also engaging with the Cascadia partnership to bring in a dialogue around how this mapping can kind of inform cross-border dialogue about ecosystem management.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, so question from Gerald Feist in Rock Creek. Will they change the species they plant for reforestation because it's drier? Yes. So this is something that the government is looking at now. Certainly, it's a long-term initiative to change not just the species selected for reforestation, but also the seed sources. So even within a species, there's a climate-based seed transfer system that's being implemented to choose your seed, not necessarily from your local site, but from further south or further downhill, based on under the assumption that that seed source would be better adapted to the future warmer and drier climates. Okay. So are there any positives to this shift to drier, warmer climates with regard to land use planning and forestry in BC? For example, increased opportunity for growing food crops that require drier, warmer climates in areas that traditionally had forested ecosystems. That's certainly one for agrologists. I think that there will be possibly some winners and losers with climate change, and there are some opportunities that this kind of climate disruption can offer. Whenever I'm thinking about those opportunities, I always try to stay mindful of the challenges. That what does it look like to transition from a forested ecosystem to a productive crop, that's a big transition for that ecosystem. And something like fire, for example, fire is what does that work for us often in transitioning forested ecosystems into grassland ecosystems, and those will be happening in our most populated areas. So there's certainly a lot of challenges that come along with those opportunities. But certainly. Yeah.
Jump in a little bit here, just because I just wanted to add that we're already seeing a change in some of the agricultural crops that are happening in the Boundary region over the last 20 years. Some of it is based off economies, and some of it for sure is based off climate. And I know that's been seen in a variety of different agricultural areas throughout BC. So it's not really speaking per se to what are we growing in areas that were traditionally forested, but with the climate, it's also big one that we're looking at is the changing in irrigation practices. How do we better handle the water use for some of the different crops that are coming in there, and tying into, of course, the climate change.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's why these type of projections can be really helpful, is because they do translate climate change into a language like BEC that has management implications, right? So we understand that we will need to manage these ecosystems for different species and different processes, like different disturbance regimes.
Yeah, different pests, different diseases. Yeah,
and agrologists are thinking the same things and looking further south for crops that are going to be appropriate for the future climates of BC. Okay, so next question: why did recent I'm having trouble reading this question.
Yeah, I'm just looking at it. Why is in some Grand Forks areas IDF became ICH relative to the reference? So I guess why are we switching from IDF to ICH?
Yeah.
Bill, let us know if we've got that correct. I'm sort of checking over here in my chat box.
That's a good question. It may be because, so let's look at, so this is summer temperature going up, and we can see change in summer precipitation is generally, as we go warmer, we get drier summers, okay? So let's just look at winter temperature and winter precipitation. And we see almost exclusively as we get warmer, we get wetter in these models. That's what the model projections are saying. Interestingly, the last 30 years has been an opposite trend. It's been getting warmer and drier, even in the winters. So when we look at our recent climate change, take a second to load.
Yeah, and I'll just, while you're loading it, I've just got the feedback from Bill, and it says exactly, it seems odd for IDF to turn into ICH with warmer temperatures. Maybe I saw it wrong though.
So even though we have warmer and drier in winter, warmer and drier in summer, we're still seeing ICH in these areas. So this is the kind of thing that I don't know the ICH MK1 ecosystem very well. I mean, I've worked in it, and it is, but I'd want to talk to Deb about, how do we interpret that and really start to drill down into the observed climate changes to understand why you would see that happening. So yeah, this shows you, you do have to have your brain turned on when you're looking at these. And there is the potential for kind of strange or erroneous classifications due to novel climates, where the model has where you have a new condition that isn't represented on the landscape historically, and the model has to choose the best fit for that new condition. And so it'll give it a name like the ICH MK1, but it's not necessarily a good fit. And so that's the kind of thing that I look at as well. That's what I did my PhD on. So that kind of thing can happen, but generally we do see these classifications. They tend to make sense, but sometimes you have to drill down into why they make sense.
I think that's great, Colin. And I know that something I've always heard is, these models are a tool, and then you do the ground truthing. You sort of use it as a big picture, look at it, and then figure out, is that making sense to what we're seeing?
Yeah, and this is something that we're doing a lot with the interpretations of these kind of projections, where we're doing tree species suitability projections based on these biogeoclimatic projections. And it's really all about going out and saying, okay, we're seeing a transition from IDF or MS to ICH. Do we see evidence of that in the vegetation? Do we have trials of tree planting trials where traditionally you wouldn't have expected, say, cedar to grow on these sites, but now they are, or that kind of thing. So ground truthing is really critical for this.
Thank you. Is there any other questions? It looks like we sort of finished the questions there in the chat. So I'm going to ask another question here, but
Sure.
that we got one just jumped right in there right before me. Do you think that citizen science has a role in assessing the projections? And if so, what kind of role do you think it would be? So maybe does citizen science have a role in some of the ground truthing, I'm thinking, and maybe that feedback component?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think behind that question, there's probably some really good ideas. I'd love to hear the ideas. But beyond that, I think citizen science is really has an important role to play, and it's just something that we could do a lot more of. So the things I'm thinking of are, especially where you see indicators of change popping up in the ecosystem, where people are living on the land, working in the land, and see change that I'm certainly not going to be seeing from my office. And Deb is spread out all over a huge region, and maybe won't be seeing these things as soon as many of the the hundreds of people that are tuned into the ecosystems in this region. So I think early warnings of change or ecosystem transitions are a really key thing that citizens can add. And the other thing I think about a lot is with ecosystem practitioners like foresters or biologists working on the land. If they can be adding their knowledge and observations of what's going on in the landscape, that can really help. So I think I think the key citizen science is really made possible by systems, where people can share their knowledge, and so I'm really supportive of those types of initiatives. But also, please get in touch with me if you have other ideas. because I'm interested in that.
My question, so I just sent them through here. My question was also, so you spoke about seed sourcing tied into the climate projections, or planting species for knowing what's going to happen in the climate. How far out do you go? So I'm thinking, it's one of the things that's come up, you know, if we're planting the species, if I plant for a climate that is projected 30 years, is that species going to make it until it hits that 30-year mark? Or do I plant for a species that is right now, and then 30 years out, we've got a problem? How do you manage that? Do you?
So this gets to the immense challenge of doing ecosystem management and forestry in a transitory climate, where, you know, the climate that we're planting species into is not the same climate that they're going to be maturing in.
Yeah.
And so they need to be resilient to both of those kind of conditions. And so the short answer is, with the climate-based seed transfer system, they are really focusing on about 15 years into the future as kind of the target climate. And so what that does is it accounts for about 1 degree of temperature change up to present, and another degree of temperature change to 15 years in the future. So it's kind of a 2 degrees temperature change. And that really recognizes that the most challenging time in a tree's life is when it's a seedling, in many ecosystems and many tree species. And so we really need to make sure these trees get established. But if we weren't doing any climate-based seed transfer, we'd actually be planting trees into planting the local trees into climates that are already too warm. So doing some amount of climate-based seed transfer, even to the present, is reducing the risk of regeneration failure. I got a quizzical look from you, Christina.
Oh no, it's just interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
But then so that was kind of the short answer. But then the more nebulous answer is that really this comes down to a professional decisions, and putting as much information in front of professionals as they need to make the decision. So, and the reason you need to do that is because each ecosystem is different and each species is different. And so, you know, some species in some ecosystems, regeneration problems may not be nearly as much of a factor as what that tree needs to be resilient to in, say, 30 years from now. Whereas in others, there may be frost limitations or drought limitations that strongly constrain your establishment options, the trees you can put in the ground, regardless of what that climate's going to be like in the future. And so that's, you know, each forester or forest professional working in this province is to a greater or lesser extent an expert in the bioclimatic ecosystem classification for their local area. Yep. They know these ecosystems, and so if you can give them projections of what the future might look like, then they can make informed decisions about what strategy to take.
Thank you. Okay, I've got one more question. If nobody else, so I'm sort of watching here. If anybody else has any questions, feel free to just quickly jump those in. Do we know any other countries that you think are doing a really good job at figuring out how to plant and sort of that forestry, knowing that we've got that changing climate? It's a very big picture question. I just know that there's been a lot of lessons learned from other countries and other areas.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I haven't seen anything that I've found to be as compelling as the approach that we're taking here. You know, certainly we see climate-based seed transfer systems being developed in the Western United States as well. But one of the challenges is that almost every other jurisdiction in the world doesn't have a BEC system. This is something that's really unique and uniquely powerful. And it's just a legacy of the vision of Dr. Kraina and the BC government in the 70s and 80s and 90s to develop this system and invest in it as much as they did. And now we are reaping the benefits of that investment, where we have this very detailed knowledge base about climates and soils and ecosystems that we can use to interpret climate change. So I think I'm exposing maybe some of my ignorance about international approaches.
No.
But having looked around, we haven't seen anything quite as sophisticated as this.
Well, thank you. And I apologize. I keep trying to mute myself because I know there's a lot of background noises. I'm in an office, so I can see that going on. I just want to say we're at 11, a few minutes here before the end of the presentation, so conscious of time. I just really wanted to thank Colin and Deb very much for your time. I know time it takes to put together some of this information, and we've really appreciated it. I know I've learned a lot through this process. And oh, sorry, I'm getting, of course, we get the chat coming in there right as I'm chatting here. But yeah, thank you for the time. For the attendees and the folks that are online here, if you do have any more questions, and if we do want to spend a bit more time going through some of the specifics, or if there's some focused areas that we want to sort of touch in, and I think this is a pretty interesting avenue to being able to understand what's happening in that big picture of what's going on in the ecosystem. And I realized, so yeah, here's the question. We don't put in the developed lands for BEC zoning. I think it's all just undeveloped. So it's sort of that base ecosystem. So is there any, would that ever be put in, like sort of that developed, or is it?
Well, that gets to the essence of what the BEC system is. It's all about the climate and soil drivers of ecosystem function. So, like Vancouver has bioclimatic climate maps. Even though a lot of it's paved and forested with exotic species, yeah, it's still the climate is still the climate of that place, right? Okay. And so these maps show the vegetation potential of the climates, of the locations, and whether they're paved or farmland or anything else doesn't change what the climate is.
I can just keep asking questions because I think this is super interesting. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the time, and yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much for the invitation, and thanks to all of you for joining. And I'm totally open to any further questions you have. I really appreciate it. It's been great to get these questions.
Okay. Do you want to? I wonder if we just want to put in an email address, or do you want questions to come through me and then I can move them through? That might be easier.
Sure.
Okay.
Do that. Yeah.
So yeah. So and I'll type in my email address into the chat box here. So Anderson, Watershed. So as I mentioned, this is being recorded. We will be putting up the recording on the RDKB, Boundary Integrated Watershed Service website. And so you're welcome to log in there to pick up the recording. And also if you want me to send it directly to you, by all means, just email me and I certainly can do that. And we can certainly move some questions through to Colin and Deb.
Okay, and I'll just type my email in here too. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christina.
Have a good day.